"We're here to discuss your failing company," Dad announced. Mom nodded sadly. That's when my sister gasped, staring at her phone. "Why is your face on Forbes' most powerful women list?" The room went silent. I've replayed that moment probably 1,000 times since it happened. The way Dad's voice landed on the word failing. Not angry, not cruel, just matter of fact, like he was reading a weather report. The way Mom nodded, that slow, sad dip of her chin that she's been doing my whole life to signal that she agrees with whoever is speaking, but doesn't want to be the one who said it out loud. And my sister, who had been mid-sentence about onboarding timelines and mentorship structures, going completely still as she looked down at her phone screen. I want to tell this right, because the easy version of this story is satisfying in a clean, simple way. Girl builds empire, dismissive family gets their comeuppance, everyone learns a lesson. That version is real enough, but the fuller version is messier and sadder and more complicated. And I think it's the one worth telling, because the thing that gets left out of the clean version is everything that came before that room. The years of it, the specific texture of being quietly written off by the people who are supposed to know you best, the way that shapes you, the way you learn to stop explaining yourself and just work. So let me start earlier. Let me start where it actually started. I grew up in a house where achievement was the primary language. Not warmth, not curiosity, not creativity. Achievement. The kind you could point to, the kind you could list on a resume or mention at a dinner party without needing to explain it. Grades, titles, institutions with recognizable names. My dad built his firm from 2 employees to 60 over the course of 25 years, which is genuinely impressive, and which he mentioned in some form at almost every family gathering I can remember. My mom ran the household with the same efficiency she'd brought to her decade in corporate law before she stepped back to raise us. She was brilliant and organized and had very specific ideas about what a successful life looked like. My sister was 4 years older than me and had, from approximately age 12, understood exactly what that house rewarded and calibrated herself to produce it. She was sharp and driven and good at the game in a way that I genuinely respected, even when it exhausted me. She got the grades, she got into the right schools, she dressed the right way and said the right things at the right moments, and by the time she was 28, she was CFO of Dad's firm, which everyone treated as though it was the natural and inevitable outcome of her gifts, rather than also the outcome of being the boss's daughter in a firm where the boss believed in keeping things in the family. I was not the problem child, exactly. I want to be clear about that. I didn't act out. I didn't fail classes or get in trouble or cause scenes. I was quiet and I worked hard and I did well. But I did well at the wrong things. I was interested in systems, how things fit together, why certain processes broke down, what the underlying architecture of a problem was. I liked building things. I liked figuring out inefficiencies and redesigning them. I spent a summer in high school reorganizing the inventory system at a local hardware store because the owner was a family friend and I'd watched him lose track of 3 separate shipments in 1 month, and it made me genuinely crazy. I built him a tracking spreadsheet and then a simple database and then talked him through automating his reorder points. And at the end of the summer, he told my dad I was some kind of genius. My dad said, "That's nice, but you should focus on your college applications." This was not said meanly. That's the thing I want people to understand. My dad is not a villain. He's a man who grew up in a specific world with a specific map for what success looks like, and he loved me and he wanted that success for me. And in his map, the hardware store database wasn't on the route. It was a detour, a hobby, something you did before you got serious. The word hobby entered the vocabulary pretty early. My sister used it first, I think, when I was in high school and had started building simple websites for local businesses on weekends. She said it with a kind of affectionate condescension, the way you describe a little kid's lemonade stand. "It's cute that she has her little hobby," she said once on the phone, not knowing I was in the next room. She's not wrong that it's not a real business, but I think it's good for her confidence. I was 16. I was charging $300 a website and had a wait list. I didn't tell her that. I didn't tell any of them that. I just kept working. I went to a good school, not the school my dad wanted. He had a specific one in mind, one of the names that shows up on the short list when people in his circles talked about where their kids went, but a good one, with a strong business program and a computer science department that had produced a handful of people whose work I actually admired. My parents were outwardly supportive and privately disappointed, which is a very specific combination that I grew up fluent in. Mom asked once whether I'd reconsidered transferring, the way you ask someone if they want a glass of water when you've already decided they're going to say yes. I hadn't. I majored in business with a concentration in operations. I took every course I could find that touched on systems design, process efficiency, workflow architecture. I was not the most social person on campus. I had a small group of close friends, and I spent a lot of time in the library and a lot of time in front of a laptop. And people who didn't know me probably thought I was either very studious or very boring. I was fine with that. I also kept building. I did freelance work through college, websites, databases, custom tools for small businesses that didn't have the budget for enterprise software. By my junior year, I had consistent clients and was clearing more per month than most of my classmates made at their internships. I didn't broadcast this. It didn't feel like anything to announce yet. It was just work. It was just practice. My sister graduated the year I started college, came home, and went straight into Dad's firm. Every time I talked to her on the phone that first year, she asked me if I'd thought about what I was doing after graduation, with an implication in her voice that suggested she already had a place for me in mind, somewhere with benefits and a salary and a proper title. I told her I was still figuring it out. She told me Dad could put in a word. I told her I appreciated it. I graduated and went to work for a mid-sized financial services company in operations, not because I'd given up on building things, but because I wanted to learn the inside of an industry before I tried to fix it. I wanted to understand how the machine actually worked before I tried to rebuild it. This is something I believe strongly. You can't design solutions to problems you don't fully understand, and you can't fully understand problems you've only read about. You have to be in the room. You have to watch the failure happen in real time. I spent 6 years in that industry. I moved around twice, different companies, different roles, slightly different vantage points on the same fundamental structural problems. And over those 6 years, I watched the same inefficiencies reproduce themselves in every organization I touched. I kept detailed notes, not because I had a grand plan yet, just because I'm the kind of person who keeps detailed notes. I have notebooks from those years that are basically blueprints, just waiting for the context I didn't have yet. By the time I was 28, I had a very clear picture of exactly what was broken and roughly what a better version would look like. I also had enough saved to live lean for 18 months without a salary, and I had a specific opportunity. One of my clients at the time was a small credit union that was drowning in a manual reconciliation process that ate 40 hours of staff time every month. I knew I could automate most of it. I knew they'd pay for that, and I knew that if I could build the right tool for them, I could sell it to the 20 other organizations I knew of with the exact same problem. I gave notice on a Friday. I told my manager I was going to start a company. She wished me luck and said to call her if I needed a reference. I told my family that weekend. My dad listened carefully and then asked who my investors were. I told him I was bootstrapping. He asked what my runway was. I told him 18 months. He nodded in the way he nods when he has a strong opinion. He is choosing not to share, and asked if I'd considered waiting until I had more capital lined up. My mom asked if I had health insurance sorted. My sister asked, with what I think was genuine curiosity, what exactly the product was going to be. And then, as I started to explain, got a phone call and excused herself. She came back 20 minutes later, and we talked about something else. I drove home and opened my laptop and started writing the first version of what would eventually become the core of my company. The first year was the hardest, and I say that knowing the second year was also very hard. The difference is that in the first year, the hardness had a particular texture. It was the hardness of building something from nothing in a spare bedroom in an apartment that cost me $1,100 a month that I was paying for out of savings, while generating almost no revenue, with no one to tell whether it was going or working except myself. I worked at a folding table next to the window because natural light helped me think. I had a whiteboard on the wall covered in diagrams that my friend who came to visit once described as either a business plan or evidence of a breakdown. I ate a lot of the same 5 meals on rotation because deciding what to eat was a variable I didn't have bandwidth for. I slept badly and woke up early and went to bed late, and this was fine because when you're building something you care about, the sleeplessness has a different quality than ordinary insomnia. It's not anxious, it's just alive. My first client was the credit union. I delivered a working prototype in 6 weeks. They ran it parallel to their manual process for a month to verify the outputs, and when the numbers matched, they handed me a check and a 1-year contract. I remember holding that check in the parking lot outside their building and thinking, okay, this is real. Something in my chest settled that day that had been humming with uncertainty since I'd left my job. I built slowly after that. I didn't take outside money. I want to explain why, because people ask this a lot. It wasn't stubbornness or lack of options. I'd had conversations with a few early-stage investors who were interested, and I turned them down. The reason was simple. I had a very specific vision for what I was building, and I'd watched enough companies lose that vision the moment outside capital entered the picture. I wanted to control the product. I wanted to control the pace. I wanted to build the right thing rather than the fast thing. Bootstrap felt slower from the outside, but it meant the company was mine, structurally and philosophically, in ways that matter enormously when you're making hard decisions. The second client came through a referral from the first. The third was cold outreach. I wrote a detailed breakdown of the problem and mailed it, physical mail, to the operations director of a regional bank I'd researched. He called me 2 weeks later. He said nobody had ever mailed him an actual letter before. We signed a contract a month after that. By the end of year 1, I had 4 clients and 1 employee, someone I'd known from my second job who had the kind of meticulous process brain that I knew I needed more of on my team. The revenue wasn't enough to call the company successful in any traditional sense, but it was enough to know the model worked. It was enough to keep going. My dad called around my 1-year mark and asked how things were going. I said they were going well. He asked if I'd thought about what the exit strategy was, if I'd considered the risks of staying in too long, if I'd set a clear decision point for when I'd go back to a proper job if it didn't work out. I said I had a decision point in mind. I didn't tell him what it was. He told me the offer at his firm was still there, that he'd kept the door open, that he just wanted me to know. I told him I appreciated it. I hung up and went back to work. The pattern in that first year with my family was that the conversations fell into a small number of categories. The first was the check-in that was really a probe. How are things going? Meant, are you ready to admit this isn't working? The second was the pivot to the job offer. Delivered gently, almost apologetically, but reliably present in any conversation that lasted long enough. The third was the silence around the actual work. Nobody asked what I was building, what the product did, what problem I was solving. This was the one that lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable and stayed. I don't think they were doing it intentionally. I want to be fair to them. I think they had a picture in their heads of what I was doing. Some vague notion of a small digital service, a one-woman freelance operation, the kind of thing you do before you find your footing. And that picture was fixed enough that new information didn't really have anywhere to land. When you've already categorized something, you stop observing it. You just keep checking it against the category. By year 1, the category was little hobby. That was where I lived, in their mental map. And I was starting to understand that it didn't matter much what I did. The category wasn't going to change until something happened that was too big to ignore. So I kept my head down. I kept building, and I waited for the thing that would be too big to ignore. Year 2 was when things started moving in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Not because I'd gotten lucky, I want to be precise about this, but because the first year had been spent building something that actually worked. And when you build something that actually works in a space full of things that don't, word travels. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, through the specific channels where people in an industry talk to each other about what's making their jobs harder and what isn't. I got a call in the spring of year 2 from a woman who ran operations at a mid-sized regional lender. She said she'd heard about my work from the credit union. She and the operations director there had been at a conference together and he'd mentioned me. She had the same problem, a slightly different scale, a slightly different configuration, but the same fundamental breakdown. We talked for an hour on the phone, and by the end of the call, I had my 5th client. Then she referred me to 2 more, and those 2 referred me to others. This is the part of building something that's hard to explain to people who haven't done it. There's a period where you're grinding and nothing moves, and you start to wonder if you're wrong about all of it, and then something shifts. Some critical mass is reached, and suddenly the motion is coming partly from outside you instead of entirely from within. You still have to work. You have to work harder, actually, but the direction is clearer. I hired a 2nd employee in the summer of year 2, then a 3rd by fall. I moved out of the spare bedroom and into a small office, a single room in a shared workspace building, 1,200 square feet with 1 window and a broken radiator that I was always meaning to get fixed. It was the best space I'd ever worked in. I loved that office. I loved the way it felt to have somewhere to go in the morning that was separate from where I slept. I loved having people to work with, to argue about implementation details with, to sit in silence next to while we all pushed toward the same thing. The company was not glamorous at this point. I want to be specific about that. We were solving a narrow problem for a niche industry and we were doing it well, but we were not a startup in the headline sense of the word. There were no press releases. There were no industry events where I was on a panel. We were 8 people in a small office building something quietly and precisely. And that was exactly what I wanted. My sister called in the fall of year 2 to tell me about a new initiative at Dad's firm. She was excited about it, a technology modernization project that she was leading, something about upgrading their internal systems, something about bringing in consultants. She talked for a while about the scope and the budget and how many people were involved. I listened. At the end, almost as an aside, she said they'd actually been looking at vendors for part of the workflow. And it was funny. The problem they were trying to solve sounded similar to what I was doing, wasn't it? She laughed a little when she said it, like the overlap was a cute coincidence. I could have told her then. I could have said, actually, I know exactly what you're dealing with, and here's how we've solved it for 11 other organizations in the last year and a half, and I'd be happy to talk about whether we'd be a fit. I didn't. Partly because I didn't want to do business with my family's company, at least not yet, but also, honestly, partly because something in me wanted to let them arrive at it themselves. I wanted to see if they could see it, if they were actually paying attention to what I was doing, or if they were still looking at the category instead of the company. They brought in a different vendor. That vendor's implementation took 8 months, went over budget by 40%, and solved about 60% of the actual problem. My sister mentioned this on the phone about a year later, frustrated and exhausted, and I said that sounded really difficult, and she said yes it was, and we talked about something else. I had 9 clients by the end of year 2. I was profitable enough to pay everyone on my team well and still reinvest meaningfully in the product. I had a wait list for the first time. I was starting to think seriously about scale, not just growing the client list, but thinking about what the product looked like if it could serve 50 organizations, 100, more, what the architecture needed to become, what the team needed to look like. This was the part of building that I found most interesting and also most difficult. The leap from something that works well at a small scale to something that works well at any scale is not incremental. It's a redesign, and you have to be willing to take apart the thing you built and rebuild it smarter, which requires a specific kind of detachment from your own work. We spent 6 months of year 2 doing exactly that. It was painful and necessary, and by the end of it, we had something that could grow without breaking. Thanksgiving that year, the word hobby was still in rotation. I remember specifically because I'd spent the preceding week closing a contract with my 14th client and had worked until 2 in the morning, 2 nights in a row to make the implementation deadline. And then I drove 3 hours to my parents' house and sat at the table and heard that word and thought about the contract and the late nights and the 14 organizations running on something I'd built from nothing. And I looked down at my plate and ate my food and said nothing. There was no point in saying anything. They weren't asking. And I was still in the category. Year 3 was the year everything got serious. Not in the way that implies the prior years weren't serious. They were. They were the foundation. Without them, there's nothing. But year 3 was the year the scale tipped from something that worked to something undeniable. And the funny thing about undeniable is that it doesn't feel undeniable from the inside while it's happening. It feels like a lot of decisions made under a lot of pressure with incomplete information and an abiding low-level fear that any of them could be wrong. The biggest decision of year 3 happened in January. A private equity firm had been watching us. Watching is probably the right word. It turned out they'd had someone look at our client base and our retention numbers and our growth trajectory months before they reached out. They contacted me through a mutual connection, a former colleague of mine who had moved into early-stage investment. The initial conversation was exploratory, low stakes, the kind of call where everyone is careful to say nothing definitive. I went into it skeptical and came out of it thinking more carefully. I want to explain what a letter of intent from a private equity firm actually means in practical terms, because the phrase gets used in ways that flatten the reality of it. It's not a prize. It's not an arrival. It is a binding expression of interest interest to acquire a stake in your company at a specific valuation, subject to due diligence, with terms that you negotiate over weeks of conversations that require more legal and financial precision than I had ever had to apply to anything in my working life. It is exciting and it is exhausting, and it requires you to know your own company as well as you possibly can, because the other side of the table knows companies like yours very well, and they will find every soft spot. We spent 2 months in due diligence. I provided thousands of documents. They talked to my clients, my team, my former employers. They modeled every scenario they could imagine. I hired outside counsel to advise on the terms and spent more hours on the phone with my lawyer than I'd spent on anything non-work related in the past 3 years. At the end of it, they came back with a revised term sheet. I signed it on a Tuesday morning in my office. My head of operations was there. My lead engineer was there. We shook hands with the PE firm's representative, and then we all went back to our desks and kept working, because we had 4 implementations in flight and a product roadmap that wasn't going to execute itself. That Thursday, my sister called to ask if I'd reconsidered the offer at Dad's firm. They had a new position opening up, she said. Something more senior than what they'd proposed before. She thought it would be a real opportunity for me. I told her I was good. I didn't tell her about the term sheet. I didn't tell any of them. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I knew what would happen. I knew they'd want to be involved. I knew my dad would have opinions about the terms. I knew my sister would find a way to make it about her mentorship or her vision for where I should take my career. I knew my mom would worry about whether I was taking on too much risk. And all of that would have been noise at a moment when I needed silence. When something you've worked on for 3 years is finally happening in a real and concrete way, you need to be able to be fully inside it. I didn't have room for their version of the story, so I kept it to myself, and I worked, and 3 months later we closed. The rest of year 3 was marked by 2 things: growth and the first real taste of visibility. The PE close meant we had capital to expand the team in ways I'd been holding back on. I hired 6 people in the spring. We moved out of the shared workspace into a proper office, a real one, full floor, enough room to grow into. I remember the first morning I walked into that office and stood in the middle of it while it was still empty before the furniture arrived, and thought about the folding table next to the window, the whiteboard, the single radiator that never worked properly. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt responsible. The way you feel when the thing you've been carrying quietly becomes visible enough that other people can see it too. The visibility came in other forms as well. We started showing up in industry publications, not prominently, not yet, but in lists and roundups, brief mentions and pieces about process automation. A trade publication ran a short profile of the company that mostly focused on our retention numbers, which were anomalously high for the space. I read it on my phone on the train home one evening and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and exposure, the way you feel when something private becomes slightly public. My clients talked about us. I didn't think about what that meant for reputation or recognition. I just thought about whether we were solving their problems well enough that they'd still be clients in 2 years. But the trade piece got read by someone, and that someone shared it. And sometime in the late fall of year 3, I received an email from an editor at Forbes who said they were compiling their most powerful women in business list and had received several independent recommendations of my name. Would I be open to an interview? I stared at that email for a long time. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer to make sure there was nothing I needed to be careful about disclosing given the PE arrangement. She said it looked fine. I wrote back to the editor and said yes. The interview took 3 hours over 2 sessions. I talked about the company, the problem we were solving, the decision to bootstrap, the arc from a spare bedroom to where we were. The editor asked about my family, about where I'd come from, about whether there had been people who believed in me early. I gave honest answers, which meant the family piece of it was not a simple narrative. I said I'd built the company mostly on my own. She asked what I meant by that. I said the people closest to me had complicated feelings about entrepreneurship that were rooted in genuine love and genuine fear and genuine unfamiliarity with building things from scratch. She wrote it down. The Forbes list was scheduled to drop in mid-November. The publication date was about 3 weeks away from the family meeting. I didn't know the family meeting was coming. The calendar invite came on a Monday morning. I was in back-to-back calls until noon and didn't see it until I was eating lunch at my desk. The subject line said, "Next steps for your future." It was sent by my sister with my parents on the copy. The location was my parents' house. The proposed time was the following Saturday at noon. There was no agenda in the body, just the subject line and the date and a single line from my sister. "Think it would be really good for us all to sit down together. Let me know if this time works." I looked at it for a while. The thing about receiving a calendar invite with that subject line when you are 32 years old and running a company with 41 clients and 22 employees and a private equity partnership is that it produces a very specific emotional response that I'm not sure I can describe exactly. It's not quite insulted. It's not quite amused. It's something more specific. It's the feeling of being seen as a version of yourself that you stopped being a long time ago, by people who have every reason to have updated their picture of you and simply haven't. I accepted the invite. I want to explain why because people ask. The answer is complex, but the simplest version is they're my family, and I love them, and I have never stopped wanting them to see me clearly. Even after 3 years of the word hobby, and the question about the job at Dad's firm, and the conversations that always somehow found their way back to when I was going to do something more stable. Even after all of that, there was still a part of me that showed up to these things hoping it would be different this time. That part never fully disappears. I think it's worth saying that plainly because the version of this story that makes me look purely strategic and unsentimental isn't accurate. I went because I wanted to see my family. I went because I was curious what version of next next steps they'd work themselves up to this time. And if I'm being fully honest, I went because some part of me was tired of carrying what I was building in silence, and I thought maybe, not probably, maybe, this would be the conversation where I could finally put it down. In the week before the meeting, I didn't think about it much. I had too much else to focus on. We were in the middle of a major product update that my lead engineer and I had been working toward for months, the kind of architectural change that requires every person on the team to hold a lot of complexity in their heads simultaneously. I had 3 client calls that week. I had a board update to prepare. I had a hiring decision to finalize. I thought about the meeting briefly on Friday evening when I was packing up to leave the office. I thought about what they'd likely say, ran through the shape of the conversation in my mind, and concluded it would probably go the way these things had always gone. A gentle intervention around my choices, the job offer surfaced and placed on the table, an expectation that I'd accepted, or at least softened toward it under the accumulated weight of family concern. I thought about whether there was a version of the conversation where I told them clearly what I'd built. I thought about whether they'd hear it. I wasn't sure they would, and if they didn't, it would be worse than not saying it, because then I'd have laid something important down in front of people who looked at it and didn't see it, and that particular experience is one I'd had enough of. So I decided I'd go, I'd listen, and I'd see how it went. I didn't decide anything past that. I drove there Saturday morning. The drive was 40 minutes on a clear day, slightly longer that morning because of weather. I had a podcast on but wasn't really listening to it. I was thinking about the product update. I was thinking about the hiring decision. I was somewhere else until I turned onto my parents' street and the house came into view. And then I was here, in this specific present, driving toward this specific hour. I parked on the street, sat in the car for a minute. The sky was the particular shade of gray that happens in November, just before it decides whether to be overcast all day or clear. There were leaves on the ground that hadn't been raked yet. The front light was on. I got out of the car and went inside. They were already at the table when I came in. I'd expected this. My family runs on the assumption that early is on time and on time is late, and the fact that I was 3 minutes ahead of the scheduled start meant they'd been there for at least 20 minutes. There's a particular quality to a room where people have been waiting for you that I've never been able to fully tune out. It changes the air somehow. Dad was at the head of the table in the chair he always sits in, the one with the slightly higher back that was my grandfather's and that nobody else ever sits in unless we're playing a game and someone needs a throne. Mom was to his left with her hands folded on the table. There was a cup of tea in front of her that was not quite steaming, which is how I calculated the 20 minutes. My sister was across from the chair they'd left for me. She had a notepad in front of her that she'd clearly made notes on. I didn't try to read them. I took my seat, said hello, asked if everyone was doing okay. Everyone was doing okay. Mom offered me coffee. I said yes. She got up to get it, and the few minutes of that gave the room something to do. A small parenthesis before the main thing. I watched my dad arrange the folder on the table in front of him, squaring it up with the edge of the table the way he does with documents, a reflex from decades of preparing for presentations. I watched my sister flip to the top page of her notepad and then look at it and then look at me. She had the expression I recognized. I've mentioned it before, the one that means she's already decided where this ends. She wore it at family dinners when there was a decision to announce that she knew not everyone would like. She wore it in the years after she joined Dad's firm, when she started treating company decisions as fixed points that the rest of us would eventually come around to. She wore it with a kind of equanimity that could read as confidence and could also read as an inability to tolerate uncertainty. I was never fully sure which it was. Mom came back with the coffee. We exchanged a few minutes of surface talk, the drive, the weather, how she'd been since her last visit to us, a brief mention of the neighbor situation Dad had been navigating. I held the coffee cup with both hands and contributed what was needed and waited. There's a very specific moment in these conversations where the preamble tips over into the actual purpose and everyone in the room knows it's coming. You can feel it building. The way the small talk starts to get slightly effortful, the silences get a half second longer, people start to sit up a little straighter. I'd been in enough of these meetings to recognize the moment. Dad said he wanted to start by saying that everything they were about to discuss came from a place of love and genuine concern. He said it the way he says things he's practiced, evenly and with eye contact. Then he said, "We're here to discuss your failing company." The word landed. I want to give it its full weight. Failing. Not struggling. Not we're concerned about. Failing. Like it was already past the point of question. Like the outcome was established and we were here to discuss the cleanup. Mom nodded. That slow, sad nod. I looked at the folder on the table. I looked at my dad's face. I looked at my sister who was looking at her notepad, and I said nothing. I think sometimes the right response to something is silence. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you're choosing the precise shape of the moment rather than filling it. I had a lot I could have said. I had 3 years of context and 41 clients and a PE-backed valuation and an upcoming Forbes feature that could have walked into that room and changed its entire geometry. I could have put all of it on the table. I didn't. I sat. I waited. I let him keep going. And Dad kept going. He had clearly prepared. He walked through his concerns in order. Market viability, financial sustainability, career trajectory. He used phrases like long-term stability and real growth potential in a way that suggested he had thought about this conversation the way you prepare for a meeting with a difficult client. He referenced my age, 32, and the cost of losing years at a critical career stage. He mentioned that the company had shown some initial signs of life, but that initial signs weren't the same as trajectory. I thought about our 41 clients. I thought about our retention rate, which was 89% year over year, which in this space was extraordinary. I thought about the 22 people on my payroll and the product roadmap we'd been building everything, and the PE firm that had spent 2 months analyzing every cell of our financial model and had written a very large check. I thought about all of this and said nothing, while my dad explained the risks of not having a real job. My sister jumped in at some point. She had the notepad. She'd clearly done some preparation of her own, which I found genuinely touching in a sad kind of way. She talked about market saturation in the fintech automation space, citing numbers that were 3 years out of date. She talked about burn rates for companies at my stage, which wasn't accurate because we weren't burning anything. We were profitable, had been for 2 years, but I understood that she was working from a model of what she thought I was, not what I actually was. She talked about the personal risk. She talked about how there was no shame in recognizing when something wasn't working. Then she slid the folder across. It stopped in front of me, and I looked at it. Inside, a printed job description. Junior analyst, my dad's firm. Start date of the 1st of next month. Mom had circled the health insurance section in red pen and written very stable in her handwriting with a small arrow. My sister started talking about the onboarding process, about how she could personally walk me through the first few weeks, about how she'd already put in a word with the team leads so I'd have a warm reception. I looked at the folder, then at my dad, then at the folder. The folder had probably been in preparation for a while. The red pen annotation was the kind of thing you do when you've been sitting with something, when you've thought about how to make it land. I could picture my mom at the kitchen table the night before, circling that section, writing those words in her careful handwriting, trying to do something kind in the way that she knew how. I didn't open it. I just looked at the corner of it on the table and felt the weight of all the years that had led to this folder. And then my sister's phone lit up. She glanced down the way people do when they're mid-sentence, and a phone lights up and they've trained themselves to check without fully stopping. A reflex. It takes a half second and you're back, except she didn't come back. She stopped talking. I watched it happen. The sentence she was in the middle of, something about the onboarding timeline, about how quickly I could be up to speed if I started on the first. It just stopped. Not trailed off, not interrupted. Stopped. Like someone had cut a wire. Her face did something I'd never seen it do in 32 years of being her sibling. The expression she'd been wearing, the one I described, the one that already knows how the conversation ends. It didn't shift or soften or rearrange itself into something else. It went blank, completely. Like whatever signal was running, it got interrupted at the source. She picked up the phone from the table, slowly, held it in front of her face for what felt like a long time, but was probably 3 or 4 seconds, and then she turned it around and held it out toward me. Not toward Dad, toward me. The way you'd hold something up when you needed someone else to tell you what you were looking at, the way you extend your hand when you need the thing explained. There was a version of that gesture that was angry, and a version that was accusatory, and what I saw on her face was neither of those. It was just confusion. Pure, uncomplicated confusion. The kind you see on someone's face when a fact they were certain of has just stopped being true and they haven't caught up to it yet. It was a Forbes alert, one of those push notifications that comes through when something significant is going live. A preview line, a photo, a pull quote. The headline was something about the most powerful women in business. The photo was my headshot from the shoot they'd done in early October. The company name was in the pull quote. So was the valuation. I looked at the screen for a second. Then I looked at my sister's face. Then I looked at my dad. Dad had turned to look at the phone. He was reading the screen from where he was sitting, which put him at a slight angle, and I watched him squint slightly and then stop squinting as it resolved. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the folder on the table between us. Then he looked at me again. Mom made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. A small caught breath, the kind that happens when your body responds before your mind has finished processing. She'd seen the screen too. Nobody said anything. My sister set the phone back down on the table very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands aren't fully reliable. She didn't look at me. She looked at the center of the table. Not at Dad, not at the folder, not at me. Just at the surface of the table, as though something interesting and very small was located there. The silence lasted longer than comfortable silences last. It went past the point where someone would normally fill it with something. I let it go. I was in no hurry. What was happening in that room in those seconds was something I had thought about in an abstract way many times over 3 years. The moment when the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was became impossible to talk around. I had imagined it as a cleaner thing, somehow, more conclusive. What it actually felt like was quieter than that. Not triumphant, not vindicated exactly. More like finally. Finally, we're all in the same room with the same facts. Finally, we can stop having the other conversation. My dad found his voice first, and to his credit, he didn't deflect, didn't reach for a qualifier, didn't try to recalibrate quickly and make it sound like he'd known more than he had. He just said 2 words. How long? Not a question. Flat. Just 2 words dropped into the center of the table, and I think what he meant by them was everything at once. How long has this been real? How long have you known and we haven't? How long has there been a gap between what we were saying and what the actual truth was? 2 words carrying all of that. I thought about the spare bedroom, the folding table, the first check from the credit union, the 4 clients, the 8 to 14, the hard months in year 1 when I was eating the same 5 meals on rotation and sleeping badly and waking up early because the work was alive in a way that insomnia never is. The Tuesday I signed the PE term sheet and went back to my desk. The Thursday my sister called about the job offer, the 41 clients, the 22 people on my payroll, the 3 years of Thanksgivings and the word hobby and the question about the job offer and the conversations that always somehow found their way back to when I was going to do something more stable. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my coat. I reached across the table and picked up the folder, held it for a moment, and then I set it back down in the center of the table, in the exact spot where it had been, where all 3 of them could see it. Since before you started worrying about me, I said said, I didn't say it with heat. I didn't want heat. I just wanted it said, clearly once, in that room, with all of us present. Not as an accusation, as a fact, as the final item in a very long inventory. Then I turned and walked out. I drove home in the gray November light. The podcast was still playing from the morning drive. I turned it off. I drove in silence and thought about the product update and the hiring decision and the 3 client calls I had the following week. And somewhere outside the city, crossing the bridge back over, I noticed that the thing that had been sitting in my chest for 3 years, the low hum of being unseen, the specific weight of being known wrong by the people who should know you best, was, if not gone, at least lighter. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed too long. I don't know what they said after I left. I imagine they talked for a while. I imagine the folder stayed on the table. The Forbes piece ran 3 weeks later. My phone had a lot of messages that day. Some of them were from people I'd worked with for years, colleagues and clients and the team, people who had been inside the building the whole time. Some of them were from people I barely knew, acquaintances from college and old jobs who'd seen the piece and reached out. And some of them were from my family. I read all of them. I didn't respond to all of them, but I read them, and I saved one. Just one. It was from my dad. It was 4 words. I should have asked. That's it. Just that. No context, no elaboration, no apology that tried too hard to be equal to the distance between us. Just 4 words that said exactly the right thing in exactly the right size. I read it twice, then I put my phone down on my desk and went back to work. Because the company doesn't run on moments. It runs on the days before the moments and the days after them. And there's always more work to do. There's always more work to do.